Victory Feast in Persepolis, the night that changed history. History often turns on grand strategies and heroic battles, but sometimes it changes because of a single night, too much wine, and one reckless decision that could never be taken back. In the spring of 330 BCE, the ancient world stood in awe of Alexander of Macedon. At just 25 years old, he had done what generations of Greek kings only dreamed of. He had shattered the mighty Persian Empire. From Asia Minor to Egypt, from Babylon to the Iranian plateau, city after city had fallen before his armies. Now Alexander stood in Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, a city of unimaginable wealth, towering columns, and palaces built to proclaim imperial eternity. What happened there during a victory feast would echo through history as one of the most shocking and controversial acts of his entire life. Persepolis was not just another conquered city, it was a symbol. Built by Darius the Great and expanded by Xerxes, it represented Persian power, culture, and divine kingship. The city was never meant to be a bustling capital. Instead, it functioned as a sacred stage for royal ceremonies and festivals. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he did so not as a destroyer, but as a conqueror who wished to inherit the Persian throne. He ordered his troops not to loot the city indiscriminately. Yet paradoxically, he also allowed the royal treasury to be seized, an enormous fortune of gold and silver, said by ancient sources to require thousands of pack animals to transport. After months of relentless campaigning, Alexander and his companions finally allowed themselves to celebrate. The Macedonian army had endured years of hardship, battle, and loss. Persepolis offered luxury beyond imagination. Fine wines, music, silk cushions, and halls lit by flickering torches that reflected off stone reliefs depicting Persian kings of the past. A grand victory feast was organized inside the palace complex, meant to honor Alexander's triumph over Asia and to bind his Greek and Macedonian officers together in celebration. The feast followed Macedonian custom, not Persian restraint. Wine flowed freely, cup after cup, stronger than the diluted wine the Greeks were accustomed to at home. As the night wore on, laughter grew louder, discipline faded, and the boundary between celebration and chaos began to blur. Ancient historians like Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, and Curtius Rufus all describe the same turning point, the moment when alcohol overtook judgment. Among the guests was Thias, an Athenian courtesan and companion of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest generals and the future ruler of Egypt. In the haze of drunken excitement, Thias arose and addressed the room. Her words, whether carefully calculated or recklessly emotional, struck a nerve. She reminded the Macedonians of a painful memory burned into Greek history, the destruction of Athens by the Persian king Xerxes nearly 150 years earlier. Persian forces had looted and burned Greek temples, including the Acropolis, during the Greco-Persian Wars. Now, she argued, fate had offered revenge. According to ancient accounts, Thias proposed that Alexander perform a symbolic act that would forever mark him as the avenger of Greece: burn the Persian royal palace. Her speech electrified the drunken assembly. What had begun as a feast transformed into a moment of dangerous nationalism and emotional retaliation. The soldiers cheered, torches were raised, music turned wild. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to destruction. Alexander, already deeply intoxicated, did not stop them. Instead, he joined them. Carrying a torch himself, Alexander led the procession through the palace halls. Flames were thrown onto wooden ceilings and ornate furnishings. Once the fire took hold, it spread rapidly. The dry materials, combined with strong night winds, turned the palace into an inferno. Columns glowed red against the dark sky. Roofs collapsed. The ceremonial heart of Persia, built over generations, burned in a matter of hours. The fire that consumed Persepolis was not just physical, it was symbolic. With it, centuries of Persian imperial identity went up in smoke. Reliefs carved into stone survived, but the living heart of the empire was destroyed. For Greeks who saw Persia as a historic enemy, the act seemed like justice. For Persians, it was an unforgivable humiliation. And for Alexander himself, the consequences would soon become clear. As dawn broke and sobriety returned, regret followed. Ancient sources report that Alexander quickly realized the magnitude of what he had done. He ordered the fire extinguished, but it was far too late. The palace was already reduced to ruins. What had been meant as a symbolic gesture of revenge had become a strategic and moral disaster. Alexander was not merely conquering Persia, he was trying to rule it. By burning Persepolis, he alienated Persian elites whose cooperation he desperately needed. Soon after, he began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian dress, and promoting Persians into positions of power within his administration. Many historians believe this shift was in part an attempt to repair the damage done by that single drunken night. The burning of Persepolis has puzzled historians for centuries. Was it an act of calculated political theater, meant to signal the definitive end of the Persian Empire? Or was it a tragic mistake driven by alcohol, peer pressure, and emotion? The ancient accounts disagree, but they all emphasize the same truth. This was not Alexander at his strategic best. It was Alexander at his most human. Young, exhausted, intoxicated, and swept away by the moment. For modern audiences, especially in the United States, this story resonates powerfully. It reveals that even history's greatest leaders were not immune to impulsive decisions. Alexander the Great is often remembered as a near-mythical figure, undefeated in battle, a military genius whose tactics are still studied at West Point and military academies around the world. Yet the burning of Persepolis reminds us that greatness does not eliminate vulnerability. One night of excess altered how history remembered an empire and a conqueror. Today, the ruins of Persepolis still stand in modern Iran, silent witnesses to that fateful night. Tourists walk among blackened stone columns, remnants of fire damage still visible after more than 2,000 years. The site is a reminder that power can destroy as easily as it can build, and that history is shaped not only by battles and strategies, but also by moments of human weakness. The victory feast at Persepolis was meant to celebrate the conquest of the known world. Instead, it became one of the most controversial episodes of Alexander's life, a moment when alcohol, emotion, and revenge combined to change history forever. In that single night, the conqueror of kings became the destroyer of a civilization's symbol, proving that sometimes the most decisive turning points in history begin not on the battlefield, but at a banquet table.
Wine, music, and a dangerous dare inside the Persian palace. One reckless moment, fueled by wine and music, can undo what years of discipline and conquest have built. And on one unforgettable night inside a Persian palace, history crossed that fragile line. In 330 BCE, Persepolis glittered under torchlight as the most powerful man in the known world celebrated his victory. Alexander the Great, undefeated in battle, had finally crushed the Persian Empire, an enemy that had dominated Asia for centuries. The city he now occupied was not merely a capital, it was the ceremonial soul of Persia, a place where kings proclaimed their divine authority and empires displayed their eternal strength. Inside its grand palaces, carved stone walls told stories of power, tribute, and order. But on this night, those same halls would witness chaos born from indulgence. Alexander ordered a grand celebration, a victory feast unlike any other. His army had marched thousands of miles, crossed deserts and mountains, and fought relentlessly against overwhelming odds. Persepolis offered reward beyond imagination: gold, silk, perfumes, musicians, and endless wine. The feast was held inside the palace complex, surrounded by towering columns and reliefs of Persian kings who once ruled from these very halls. It was meant to be a night of triumph, unity, and release. The celebration followed Macedonian tradition, not Persian. In Greek and Macedonian culture, wine was central to social life, often consumed in large quantities during symposia. That night, wine flowed freely, undiluted and abundant. Goblets were refilled again and again as musicians played, dancers performed, and laughter echoed across the marble floors. Discipline softened. Caution faded. What remained was emotion, memory, and pride. Alexander himself was at the center of it all. Barely in his mid-20s, he carried the weight of legendary expectations. He had conquered Egypt, defeated Darius III, and claimed the title King of Asia. Yet he was also exhausted. Years of campaigning had taken a toll on his body and mind. The feast was not just celebration, it was escape. Surrounded by loyal companions, trusted generals, and entertainers, Alexander drank deeply, surrendering to the moment. As the night progressed, the music grew louder and the atmosphere more intense. Ancient historians such as Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, and Curtius Rufus described the gathering as increasingly wild. Drunken songs praised Greek victories and mocked Persian defeat. Old stories resurfaced, especially memories of the Greco-Persian Wars, when Persian armies had invaded Greece and burned Athens. Though those events had occurred more than a century earlier, they still lived in Greek cultural memory as symbols of humiliation and loss. It was in this charged environment that a single voice changed everything. Among the guests was Thais, an Athenian courtesan closely associated with Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted generals. Thais was intelligent, charismatic, and keenly aware of the emotional undercurrents in the room. Rising amid the noise and laughter, she addressed the gathering. Her words cut through the drunken haze with startling clarity. She reminded the Macedonians that this very palace represented the power of those who once destroyed Greek cities and temples. She spoke of Athens in flames, of sacred places violated by Persian kings. Then she proposed something bold, shocking, and dangerous: that Alexander should burn the Persian palace as an act of revenge, a final declaration that Greece had triumphed over Asia. The room erupted. To the drunken soldiers, the idea felt electrifying. It was not just destruction, it was symbolism. Burning the palace would mean closing a chapter of history, avenging past sufferings, and marking Alexander as the ultimate Greek hero. Cheers filled the hall. Music turned frenzied. Torches were seized. The line between celebration and mob mentality vanished. Alexander did not immediately object. Wine clouded his judgment, and the crowd's energy fed his own pride. In that moment, he was no longer the careful strategist or aspiring ruler of a unified empire. He was a victorious young king, surrounded by cheering followers, urged toward a dramatic gesture that promised eternal glory. And so, in one of the most controversial decisions of ancient history, Alexander accepted the dare. According to ancient accounts, Alexander himself took a torch and led the procession through the palace. Flames were thrown on wooden ceilings and ornate furnishings. The fire spread rapidly, fueled by dry materials and strong winds. What began as symbolic quickly became uncontrollable. The palace, once a masterpiece of imperial architecture, turned into an inferno. Columns cracked under heat, roofs collapsed, smoke filled the night sky. The fire was visible for miles, a blazing announcement that Persia's ceremonial heart was being erased. soldiers watched in awe as the flames consumed centuries of history. In that moment, it felt like triumph. But triumph did not last. As the wine wore off and dawn approached, reality returned. Alexander reportedly sobered quickly and recognized the enormity of what he had allowed. The palace of Persepolis was not just a building, it was a political symbol, a center of Persian identity. By burning it, Alexander had insulted the very people he now needed to rule. He ordered the fire extinguished, but the damage was irreversible. The consequences were profound. Alexander soon began changing his approach to governance. He adopted Persian dress, encouraged marriages between Macedonians and Persians, and promoted Persian nobles within his administration. Many historians believe these policies were attempts to repair the political and cultural damage caused by that night of excess. The burning of Persepolis remains one of the most debated events in ancient history. Some scholars argue it was a calculated act meant to signal the end of Persian imperial power. Others believe it was a tragic mistake driven by alcohol, emotion, and peer pressure. What all sources agree on is that wine, music, and a dangerous dare turned a victory feast into a turning point that reshaped Alexander's legacy. For modern American audiences, this story carries a powerful lesson. Alexander the Great is studied in military academies and leadership courses as a model of strategic brilliance. Yet this episode reveals the human cost of unchecked impulse. Even the greatest leaders can falter when pride, emotion, and indulgence override judgment. Today, the ruins of Persepolis still bear marks of that fire. Blackened stone and collapsed structures stand as silent witnesses to a single night that altered history. Visitors walk through those remains, reminded that empires can fall not only through war, but through moments of human weakness. Inside that Persian palace, surrounded by wine and music, Alexander the Great accepted a dare that history would never forget. It was a night when celebration turned into destruction, and when the conqueror of the world learned too late that some victories come at an irreversible cost.
Thias's provocation, one drunken idea that sparked fire. Sometimes history does not change because of an army, a strategy, or a king's command, but because of a single sentence spoken at exactly the wrong moment. In 330 BCE, inside the grand palace of Persepolis, wine flowed freely, music echoed through towering halls, and the most powerful conqueror on earth let his guard down. Alexander the Great, undefeated and triumphant, believed the hardest battles were behind him. Yet it was here, during a night of celebration, that a woman named Thias would speak one idea, born of alcohol, memory, and emotion, that would ignite flames still discussed more than 2,000 years later. Persepolis was not an ordinary city. It was the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, built to project divine authority and imperial permanence. Massive stone columns rose toward the sky. Walls were carved with reliefs showing tribute from every corner of the empire, and palaces symbolized the power of kings like Darius the Great and Xerxes. When Alexander captured Persepolis, he effectively captured the soul of Persia. At only 25 years old, Alexander had already achieved what few humans ever would. He had crossed continents, defeated vast armies, and ended an empire that once ruled most of the known world. His entry into Persepolis marked the peak of his early career. To honor this achievement, he ordered a massive victory feast inside the palace complex, a celebration meant to reward loyalty, relieve exhaustion, and confirm his supremacy. The atmosphere that night was intoxicating in every sense. Macedonian feasts were loud, emotional, and centered around heavy drinking. Unlike Persian traditions of restraint, Alexander's court embraced excess. Wine cups were constantly refilled. Musicians played without pause. Dancers entertained generals who had survived years of brutal warfare. Discipline, so crucial on the battlefield, slowly dissolved into laughter and bravado. Alexander himself drank deeply. Ancient sources describe him as charismatic and emotionally intense, especially under the influence of alcohol. The feast gave him a rare moment to feel human again, not a godlike commander, but a young man surrounded by friends and admirers. Yet alcohol has a way of amplifying emotions long buried beneath responsibility, and that night old memories resurfaced. The Greeks and Macedonians in the hall shared a cultural memory passed down for generations, the Greco-Persian Wars. Though these conflicts had ended more than a century earlier, their legacy still shaped Greek identity. Persian kings had invaded Greece, burned Athens, and desecrated sacred temples. For many Greeks, Persia was not just a defeated enemy, it was a historical villain. It was into this emotional environment that Thais of Athens stepped forward. Thais was not a queen or a general, but she was far from insignificant. As a courtesan associated with Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions and future ruler of Egypt, she had access to power and influence. Educated, articulate, and socially perceptive, Thais understood the mood of the room and the psychology of the men within it. As the feast reached its peak, Thais arose and spoke. According to ancient historians such as Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus, she reminded the gathering of Greece's humiliation at Persian hands. She spoke of Athens burned by Xerxes, of temples destroyed, of sacred spaces turned to ash. Then she offered a bold proposal. Alexander, she said, should burn the Persian palace as revenge, an act that would crown him as the avenger of Greece and mark the final defeat of Persian arrogance. The words landed like a spark in dry grass. The hall erupted in excitement. Drunken soldiers shouted in approval. Torches were lifted. Music intensified. What had been a celebration instantly became a moment of collective passion and nationalist fervor. Thais's idea was dangerous precisely because it felt righteous. It framed destruction as justice and revenge as honor. Alexander hesitated only briefly, if at all. Wine dulled his caution, and the crowd's energy fed his pride. In that moment, Alexander was no longer thinking as a future ruler of a multicultural empire. He was thinking as a victorious Greek king, urged to make a dramatic statement that would echo through history. And so he accepted the idea. Ancient accounts describe Alexander himself leading the procession, torch in hand. Whether symbolic or literal, the message was clear. Flames were thrown on wooden beams and luxurious furnishings. The fire spread rapidly, fueled by dry materials and strong winds. Once started, it could not be controlled. The palace of Persepolis burned. Columns glowed red under the heat. Roofs collapsed. Smoke rose into the night sky, visible for miles. What had taken generations to build was destroyed in hours. The ceremonial heart of Persia, its most powerful symbol, was reduced to ruins, not by an invading army, but by a drunken decision. In the chaos of the moment, it felt like triumph. For Greek soldiers, the fire symbolized closure and revenge, but history is often cruel in hindsight. As dawn approached and sobriety returned, realization followed. Alexander quickly understood the magnitude of what had happened. Persepolis was not merely a monument to a defeated enemy, it was a political tool he could have used to legitimize his rule over Persia. By destroying it, he had alienated Persian elites and undermined his long-term strategy. Ancient sources suggest Alexander regretted the act almost immediately. He ordered the fire extinguished, but the damage was irreversible. The palace lay in ruins, and with it, Alexander's image as a respectful successor to Persian kingship. The consequences were lasting. After Persepolis, Alexander's behavior changed noticeably. He began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian clothing, and incorporating Persians into his administration and army. He encouraged intermarriage between Macedonians and Persians, attempting to blend cultures rather than dominate one over the other. Many historians believe these policies were attempts to repair the damage caused by that single night. The role of Thais has fascinated scholars for centuries. Was she acting out of genuine patriotic anger? Was she influenced by alcohol and the emotional intensity of the moment? Or was she deliberately pushing Alexander towards a dramatic act that would solidify his Greek image? The sources do not agree, but they all confirm that her words were the catalyst. For modern American audiences, this story carries powerful relevance. It reveals how leadership can be derailed by impulse, how group emotion can overpower reason, and how a single voice, spoken at the right moment, can alter the course of history. Alexander the Great is studied in military academies across the United States as a model of brilliance and ambition. Yet the burning of Persepolis reminds us that even the greatest leaders are vulnerable to human weakness. Today, the ruins of Persepolis still stand in Iran, bearing blackened stone and fire scars that time has not erased. Visitors walk among the remains, standing where Alexander once celebrated and where Thais once spoke. Those silent ruins testify to a profound truth. History is not only shaped by battles and kings, but by moments of emotion, persuasion, and loss of control. Thais's provocation was only a few sentences spoken during a drunken feast, but it sparked a fire that changed how Alexander was remembered, how Persia was ruled, and how history itself unfolded. In that palace, on that night, one idea proved more destructive than an army, and one voice proved more powerful to burn an empire's symbol forever.
Alexander's fatal decision under the influence of alcohol. One night of alcohol can erase years of discipline, and for Alexander the Great, that night became one of the most controversial moments in world history. In 330 BCE, Alexander of Macedon stood at the peak of human achievement. At just 25 years old, he had defeated the Persian Empire, an enemy so vast and powerful that generations before him had failed to overcome it. His armies had marched from Greece to Egypt, from Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau, winning every major battle in their path. To his soldiers, Alexander was more than a king. He was invincible. Yet inside the palaces of Persepolis, far from the battlefield, alcohol would cloud his judgment and lead him to a decision that historians still debate more than 2,000 years later. Persepolis was not an ordinary conquered city. It was the ceremonial and symbolic heart of Persia, designed to display imperial authority rather than serve as a daily capital. Built by Darius the Great and expanded by Xerxes, its palaces were masterpieces of ancient architecture, decorated with reliefs showing representatives of dozens of nations bringing tribute to the Persian king. By occupying Persepolis, Alexander had achieved not just military victory, but psychological dominance over Asia. To celebrate this triumph, Alexander ordered a lavish victory feast inside the palace complex. His army had endured years of hardship, brutal combat, and constant movement. The feast was meant to reward loyalty, release tension, and unite Macedonians and Greeks in celebration. Wine flowed freely, musicians performed, and dancers entertained guests late into the night. What began as controlled celebration soon drifted into excess. Alcohol played a central role in Macedonian culture, especially during feasts. Wine was not merely a drink, It was a social bond, a symbol of fellowship and honor. But that night, the wine was stronger and less restrained than usual. Ancient sources describe Alexander as a heavy drinker during celebrations, prone to emotional extremes when intoxicated. As the hours passed, alcohol dulled his strategic instincts and heightened his sense of pride. Alexander was not immune to exhaustion. Years of continuous campaigning had taken a toll on his physical and mental state. The feast offered him an escape from responsibility, a moment to forget the burdens of command. Surrounded by loyal companions, he relaxed his discipline. Yet in doing so, he exposed himself to the most dangerous enemy of leadership, impaired judgment. As the night progressed, conversation turned from celebration to memory. Greek and Macedonian soldiers began recalling the Greco-Persian Wars, conflicts that had ended over a century earlier but still shaped Greek identity. Stories of Persian armies burning Athens and desecrating Greek temples resurfaced. The emotional tone of the room shifted from triumph to resentment, from victory to revenge. It was in this atmosphere that Alexander faced a fatal decision. Encouraged by the crowd and influenced by alcohol, Alexander accepted the idea of burning the Persian palace, a proposal that framed destruction as justice. The palace, a symbol of Persian kinship, was seen by many Greeks as a monument to past humiliation. In his intoxicated state, Alexander allowed emotion to override reason. Rather than acting as a ruler seeking legitimacy, he acted as a conqueror seeking dramatic symbolism. Ancient historians such as Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus describe Alexander taking a torch himself, leading the procession through the palace halls. Whether symbolic or literal, his participation marked the moment when restraint disappeared entirely. Fire was set to wooden beams and lavish furnishings. Once ignited, the flames spread uncontrollably. The palace of Persepolis burned through the night. The destruction was swift and devastating. Roofs collapsed, columns cracked under extreme heat, and priceless works of art were lost forever. The blaze was visible from miles away, a fiery declaration that the heart of Persia had been destroyed. For the drunken revelers, it felt like triumph, a final act of dominance over a defeated enemy. But alcohol wears off, and when it did, reality struck hard. By morning, Alexander reportedly realized the gravity of his actions. Persepolis was not merely a symbol of Persian arrogance, it was a political asset. Alexander had intended to rule Asia, not destroy it. Burning the palace alienated Persian elites whose support he needed to stabilize his empire. It undermined his attempt to present himself as the rightful successor to the Persian kings. Ancient sources suggest Alexander deeply regretted the act. He ordered efforts to extinguish the fire, but the damage was irreversible. The palace lay in ruins, and with it, a critical opportunity for reconciliation between conqueror and conquered. This moment marked a turning point in Alexander's leadership. After Persepolis, his policies shifted noticeably. He adopted Persian customs, wore Persian dress, and integrated Persians into his administration and army. He encouraged marriages between Macedonians and Persians, promoting cultural fusion rather than domination. Many historians interpret these actions as attempts to repair the political damage caused by that single night of intoxicating decision-making. The burning of Persepolis has remained a subject of historical debate. Some scholars argue it was a calculated act meant to send a message that Persian imperial power was finished. Others see it as a tragic mistake, fueled by alcohol, peer pressure, and emotional manipulation. What is undeniable is that alcohol played a decisive role in lowering Alexander's inhibitions and amplifying his emotions.
For modern American audiences, this episode offers a powerful lesson in leadership and responsibility. Alexander the Great is studied in military academies, business schools, and leadership programs across the United States as a model of strategic genius. Yet this story reminds us that intelligence and talent cannot fully protect against human weakness. Even the greatest leaders can make irreversible mistakes when judgment is impaired. Today, the ruins of Persepolis still stand in Iran, bearing blackened stone and fire scars that time has not erased. They serve as silent witnesses to a moment when alcohol, pride, and impulse converged. Visitors walking among the ruins are reminded that history is shaped not only by battles and brilliance, but by moments of vulnerability. Alexander's fatal decision under the influence of alcohol did not erase his greatness, but it complicated his legacy. It revealed the fragile line between control and chaos, between triumph and regret. On that night, far from any battlefield, Alexander learned a timeless lesson. The greatest victories can be undone, not by enemies, but by ourselves.
Flames over Persepolis, the capital of Persia, in ashes. The fire could be seen for miles, turning the night sky red, and in those flames an empire watched its past burn away. In 330 BCE, Persepolis stood as the proud ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, a city built not for daily administration, but for eternal symbolism. Massive stone columns rose like forests of carved marble. Reliefs depicted delegations from every corner of Asia bringing tribute, and palaces proclaimed the divine authority of Persian kings. For nearly 2 centuries, Persepolis had embodied imperial power, order, and continuity. Then, in a single night, flames consumed it, and history took a dramatic and irreversible turn. Alexander the Great had arrived at Persepolis as a conqueror, not a destroyer. After defeating Darius III and dismantling Persian resistance, he captured the city without a prolonged siege. His early actions suggested restraint. He secured the massive royal treasury, one of the largest concentrations of wealth in the ancient world, but did not immediately raze the city. Alexander envisioned himself as the new ruler of Asia, inheriting Persian authority rather than erasing it. Yet victory brought exhaustion, emotion, and indulgence. To celebrate the collapse of the Persian Empire, Alexander ordered a grand feast inside the palace complex. Macedonian and Greek traditions encouraged heavy drinking during celebrations, and that night wine flowed freely. Musicians played, dancers performed, and laughter echoed through halls once reserved for imperial ceremony. Discipline slowly gave way to excess. As the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. Ancient grievances resurfaced. Greeks in the hall recalled the Greco-Persian Wars, when Persian armies had invaded Greece and burned Athens. Though more than a century had passed, those memories remained powerful symbols of humiliation. In the haze of alcohol and triumph, revenge began to feel justified. Encouraged by the crowd and influenced by emotion, Alexander made a fateful decision. Torches were taken, flames were set. What may have begun as a symbolic act quickly turned into a disaster of historic proportions. The fire spread rapidly through the palace complex. Wooden roofs, beams, and luxurious furnishings ignited almost instantly. Strong winds carried sparks from one structure to another. The palaces of Darius and Xerxes, masterpieces of ancient architecture, were soon engulfed. Columns glowed red under intense heat. Roofs collapsed, sending showers of embers into the night air. For those watching, the scene was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The heart of Persia was burning. The flames illuminated carvings that depicted kings receiving tribute from conquered peoples, a haunting contrast as imperial symbols vanished in smoke. The blaze could be seen far beyond the city, an fiery announcement that an era had ended. The destruction of Persepolis was more than physical, it was psychological. For Persians, the burning of their ceremonial capital was a profound humiliation. Persepolis was not just stone and gold, it represented identity, continuity, and divine kingship. Its destruction sent a clear message: the old order was gone. By morning, regret replaced celebration. As sobriety returned, Alexander reportedly realized the magnitude of his decision. Persepolis was not merely a monument to a defeated enemy, it was a tool of governance. By destroying it, Alexander undermined his own political ambitions. He sought to rule Persia, not terrorize it. Ancient historians suggest that Alexander ordered the fire extinguished once he grasped the consequences, but the damage was irreversible. The palace complex lay in ruins, its wealth melted or lost, its symbolic power destroyed. What centuries had built in stone and ceremony vanished in hours. The aftermath of the fire marked a turning point in Alexander's rule. Recognizing the need to reconcile with Persian elites, he began adopting Persian customs and attire. He incorporated Persian nobles into his administration and encouraged cultural integration. These policies reflected an effort to heal the wound created by the destruction of Persepolis. Historians continue to debate Alexander's motives. Some argue the burning was a calculated act of revenge, meant to avenge Greece and send a clear message to the world. Others see it as a tragic mistake, fueled by alcohol, peer pressure, and emotional manipulation. Ancient sources themselves disagree, reflecting the complexity of the event. For modern audiences, particularly in the United States, the burning of Persepolis offers a powerful lesson about leadership and impulse. Alexander the Great is often celebrated as one of history's greatest military minds, studied in military academies and leadership courses. Yet this episode reveals the dangers of unchecked emotion and impaired judgment. Even the most brilliant leaders can make catastrophic decisions under the wrong conditions. Today, the ruins of Persepolis still stand in modern Iran. Blackened stones and collapsed structures bear silent witness to that night of fire. Visitors walk among the remains, tracing scorch marks left by flames more than 2,000 years ago. The site serves as a reminder that history is not shaped only by battles and conquests, but by moments of human weakness. Flames over Persepolis did more than destroy a city. It altered how Alexander was remembered and how Persia transitioned from empire to memory. In those ashes lay the end of one world and the uneasy beginning of another. The fire that night did not just consume palaces, it burned a lesson into history itself. Power, when guided by impulse rather than wisdom, can turn victory into irreversible loss.
Mourning regret, the drunken act Alexander could never undo. The fire was gone, the wine had worn off, and silence filled the ruins. But the damage could never be undone. When dawn broke over Persepolis in 330 BCE, Alexander the Great awoke to a sight that would haunt his legacy forever. The ceremonial capital of Persia, once a symbol of imperial power and cultural pride, lay in smoldering ruins. Blackened stone columns stood like broken teeth against the pale morning sky. Ash covered palace floors where kings once walked. What had been celebrated hours earlier as a triumphant act now revealed itself as a catastrophic mistake born of alcohol, emotion, and unchecked impulse. This was the morning of regret.
Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire through discipline, intelligence, and unmatched military skill. He had defeated Darius III, dismantled Persian resistance, and captured the greatest cities of the ancient world. His ambition was not merely to conquer Asia, but to rule it, to unite Greeks and Persians under a single imperial vision. Persepolis was central to that plan. It was not just a city, it was the symbolic heart of Persian kingship. The night before, everything had gone wrong. The victory feast inside the palace complex had begun as a release after years of relentless warfare. Macedonian tradition embraced celebration through heavy drinking, and Alexander, exhausted and triumphant, allowed himself to indulge. Wine flowed freely, music echoed through vast halls, and discipline slowly dissolved into emotion. Old grievances resurfaced. Memories of Persian invasions of Greece, of Athens burned by Xerxes, were revived in drunken conversation. Under the influence of alcohol and the charged atmosphere of victory, Alexander made a decision that defied his usual strategic brilliance. Encouraged by the crowd and caught in the moment, he allowed the Persian palace to be set on fire. Whether he saw it as symbolic revenge or simply followed the momentum of the feast, the result was irreversible. Flames consumed the palaces of Darius and Xerxes, erasing centuries of Persian ceremonial power in a single night. Now, in the cold clarity of morning, the consequences stood before him. Ancient historians such as Plutarch, Arrian, and Diodorus Siculus describe Alexander's reaction with striking consistency: regret. As sobriety returned, so did judgment. Alexander reportedly ordered the fire extinguished as soon as he realized the scale of destruction, but it was far too late. The palace complex was already lost. For the first time since crossing into Asia, Alexander faced the reality that he himself had become his own greatest enemy. Persepolis was not just a defeated enemy's monument, it was a political asset. Alexander needed Persian nobles, administrators, and generals to stabilize his growing empire. By burning their most sacred imperial symbol, he had humiliated the very people whose loyalty he required. What had felt like triumph hours earlier now threatened to unravel his long-term vision. The regret was not only personal, it was strategic. Alexander had carefully cultivated an image as the rightful successor to Persian kings, not merely a foreign invader. He adopted Persian titles, respected local customs, and presented himself as king of Asia. The destruction of Persepolis shattered that image. Instead of a unifier, he now appeared as a destroyer driven by impulse. This realization marked a profound turning point in his rule. In the months following the burning of Persepolis, Alexander's behavior changed noticeably. He began adopting Persian dress, shocking many of his Macedonian officers. He incorporated Persian nobles into high-ranking positions within his administration and army. He encouraged marriages between Macedonians and Persians, including his own marriage to Roxana, a noblewoman from Central Asia. These actions were not random, they were deliberate attempts to repair the damage caused by that single drunken night. Many historians interpret these policies as acts of compensation, a ruler trying to undo what could never truly be undone. Yet regret could not restore Persepolis. The ceremonial capital remained in ruins, its role in Persian identity forever altered. For Persians, the destruction was deeply traumatic. It represented not just the fall of an empire, but the erasure of cultural memory. Persepolis had been a place of festivals, rituals, and royal continuity. Its burning symbolized the violent end of a world order that had lasted for centuries. Alexander, for all his power, could not reverse that loss. The episode reveals a side of Alexander often overshadowed by his victories, the human side. He was young, emotionally intense, and prone to extremes, especially under the influence of alcohol. Ancient sources frequently note his struggles with drinking, describing moments when wine amplified his generosity, his rage, or his recklessness. Persepolis was not an isolated incident. It was the most dramatic example of a recurring vulnerability. For modern American audiences, this story resonates deeply. Alexander the Great is studied in U.S. military academies, leadership programs, and business schools as a model of vision, courage, and strategic genius. Yet this moment reminds us that even extraordinary leaders are subject to ordinary human weaknesses. Alcohol, peer pressure, and emotional triggers can undermine even the most disciplined minds. Leadership is not tested only in moments of pressure, but also in moments of celebration. The morning after Persepolis exposed the cost of failing that test. Alexander could conquer armies, cross deserts, and defeat kings, but he could not rebuild what he destroyed in a moment of intoxication. His regret did not erase the flames from history. It only added complexity to his legacy. Today, the ruins of Persepolis still stand in Iran. Visitors walk among scorched stones and fallen columns, physical evidence of that irreversible decision. The burn marks remain visible after more than 2,000 years, silent witnesses to a night of excess and a morning of remorse. History remembers Alexander as the Great for his unmatched achievements, but it also remembers Persepolis. That morning, standing amid ashes and silence, Alexander learned a timeless lesson. Some mistakes outlive their maker. The drunken act he committed could never be undone, and its consequences became part of his story forever. Mourning regret came too late, but it ensured that the burning of Persepolis would endure not only as an act of destruction, but as one of history's most powerful reminders of the fragile line between greatness and downfall.